Hi friends, hello. How are we doing today? How is everybody? I'm doing pretty well. I'm in a pretty good mood. I hope you are too. So, today we are going to read the introduction to Before We Were Trans by Kit Heyam. I'm going to read you the back of the book real quick. I do want to let you know I will not be reading this whole book. I'm just going to be reading the intro, mostly because I do not want for people to access this whole book for free from me. I definitely think if you're interested, you should go get it and support the author, which is not me. Alright, so the back of the book says, today's narratives about trans people tend to feature individuals with stable gender identities that fit neatly into categories of male or female. Those stories, while important, fail to account for the complex realities of many trans people's lives. Before We Were Trans illuminates the stories of people across the globe, from antiquity to the present, whose experiences of gender have defied binary categories. Blending historical analysis with sharp cultural criticism, trans historian and activist Kit Heyam chronicles expressions of trans experience that are often left out of the historical record. Drawing on their own experience of transition and gender non-binarism, Heyam reveals what constitutes a man, a woman, or gender itself has continually been defined, contested, and redefined. A groundbreaking, radically inclusive trans history, Before We Were Trans reflects the richness of modern trans reality more closely than any previously written, and looks to the past to uncover new horizons for possible trans futures. Alright. Let's read the introduction, shall we? Try to find a good way to put down the book. On the night of Introduction. I had a gown on and a lark. What is trans history? On the night of Monday, 8th of June, 1847, John Sullivan was drunk. Strolling unsteadily down the street in Aldgate, East London, the 22-year-old was wearing a bonnet, a gown, a silk apron, a pair of trousers, and a pair of women's boots. Police Constable Henry Pye's attention was caught both by this attire and by the bundle John was carrying under one arm. Steering John to the local police station, he opened the bundle to find more items of women's clothing. Where, he asked John, had these come from? John said, they're mine. 6 days later, on the 14th of June, John Sullivan was tried for the theft of a cape, a handkerchief, an apron, 2 gowns, 2 petticoats, and a pair of stays. The clothes belonged to a local woman, Frances Norton, and had a total value of 13 shillings and 6 pence. Under oath, John denied stealing the clothes and dismissed the choice to wear them as a drunken joke, swearing, I had them given to me to carry to the market. The police caught me, and the person who gave me the things ran away. I had a gown on and a lark, but I had my trousers on. I was very much intoxicated. The court, mindful that this was John's second offense, following a 6-month prison sentence the previous year for a crime whose records don't appear to survive, was unsympathetic. John Sullivan was sentenced to be transported to Australia for 10 years. That's a long time. Is Is this story a part of trans history? It's unlikely that many people would treat it as such. John Sullivan lived before the word transgender, as we use it now, was widely available for individuals to describe their actions or identities. There is no evidence that John presented as female outside of the specific circumstances outlined in the trial records. Perhaps most conclusively, those trial records give us John's own testimony, framing the choice to wear women's clothes not as a matter of identity, but as a drunken lark. Surely, there's no better metric by which to judge a historical person's gender than by their own voice. These are the criteria that usually determine whether trans people feel able to talk about someone as belonging to trans history. We look for evidence that their motivation for gender nonconformity was not external but internal, ideally in the form of personal testimony. We look for the continuous presentation as the gender opposite to the one they were assigned at birth, and we look for histories that we can fit into contemporary Western ideas of what it means to be trans. Even if those criteria were met, we get anxious if the person we're dealing with lived before the advent of the terminology that we use to talk about trans identities today. Often, this in itself is enough to dismiss their trans possibility altogether. These criteria often make it difficult for us to talk about trans history at all. What makes this conversation even more difficult to have are the concepts that underpin it: gender and sex, internal and external motivations, personal testimony, stability of identity. If we poke at any one of these concepts, the whole edifice starts to crumble. When we talk about trans history, what are we even talking about? This book is about the answer to that question. Ask a trans person today what the adjective trans refers to, and while the nuances will differ, the most common definition you'll get is anyone who doesn't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. It's important to us to put it in these terms, talking about being trans as an identity rather than an action. Helps us to understand transness as relating to who you are, not what you do. A crucial step in undermining the argument that transitioning means adhering to gender stereotypes. It makes space for people who can't or don't want to transition socially or medically, and talking about moving away from the gender we were assigned at birth, rather than from male to female or vice versa, helps our definition to be clearly inclusive of non-binary people like me who don't identify as male or female all the time. This modern understanding of trans is usually dated back to the early 20th century sexology, an intellectual movement that attempted to examine sexuality and gender identity as scientific phenomena. The German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld coined the term transvestite in 1910, and although this word sounds to modern ears like a sensationalist term for cross-dressing, something that relates to the external gender expression rather than the internal gender identity, and is probably sexualized in the vein of Rocky Horror Picture Show, Hirschfeld intended it to cover a much broader range of trans identities, including people who transitioned medically, people who transitioned socially, and people who changed their gender expression some, but not all, of the time. I've got a frog in my throat. The word transsexual came by the mid-20th century to primarily indicate trans people who accessed medical transition, whose hormones and/or surgery to change their bodies so that it aligned with the physical characteristics associated with the gender they identified as. By the late 1960s, American trans activist Virginia Prince was helping to popularize the word transgender to refer to trans people who transitioned socially but not medically, living as a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth without changing their body. While this distinction persisted in common parlance for some decades, by the 21st century, and in particular, following the influence of Leslie Feinberg's 1992 book Transgender Liberation, trans identities and practices of all kinds were becoming subsumed by the umbrella term transgender. The word transsexual, while still valued by some for its connection to the history of trans activism, and particularly to that of older trans women, and while still persisting in some official quarters like the UK Equality Act of 2010, which uses it to refer to any trans person who transitions socially or medically, has become gradually replaced by trans, short for transgender, as the default word that we use to describe ourselves. Cisgender, or cis, an adjective that refers to the opposite of trans, anyone who does identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, dates back to at least the 1990s. The word cis is sometimes misunderstood as referring to stereotypes. Much of the opposition to it rests on the idea that to call someone a cis woman is to say that she is comfortable with society's narrow idea of femininity. In reality, though, the way most trans people use it is to refer not to stereotypes, but to self-identification. A cis woman is someone who was assigned female at birth and is happy to describe herself as a woman, regardless of how much she defies society's idea of what a woman should mean. Even in the past 100 years, a period in which the category of trans has been relatively coherent, thinking about trans history is a difficult and messy business. Looking back further in time, and the difficulty and messiness increases dramatically. Look back further in time, and the difficulty and messiness increases dramatically. It's not as simple as saying that while the terminology is new, the experiences are not. The advent of new terminology can genuinely shift how we think about gender, as well as what names we give to our experiences. But it's also not straightforwardly true to say that the use of the word trans to talk about gender has no history before sexology. Literary scholar Joseph Gamble has recently discovered that the 17th century writer Thomas Browne used the prefix trans and the word transition to refer to the spontaneous sex change of hairs as early as 1646, and even coined the adjective transfeminated to refer to a body that has transformed from what we think of as female to what we think of as male. That's interesting. I didn't know that word, and I would think that it would mean the opposite. So, the prefix trans was clearly relevant to thinking about gender malleability, long before Hirschfeld leveraged it to refer to the patients he saw at his Institute for Sexual Science. Yet, this doesn't mean any of us can easily map our category of trans people. As I've defined it here, back onto the past, if we try to think about what that contemporary definition, anyone who doesn't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, in historical terms, it immediately starts to break down. In England and Wales, civil birth registrations, as opposed to the noting of births and baptisms in parish records, didn't begin until 1837, and they didn't become compulsory until 1875, 20 years later than in Scotland, meaning that birth records are unlikely to include a gender marker before the 19th century. So what does it mean to be assigned a particular gender at birth before that point? And what, for that matter, do we mean by gender or sex when we're thinking about the past? These terms aren't even stable in our own society. While popular discourse often defines gender as a social construct and sex as a biological reality, sex is between your legs, gender is between your ears. This neat-sounding distinction belies the many socially determined aspects of how we think about bodies. The labels male and female are themselves socially determined. Our society labels one configuration of body parts female and one male, but what's stopping us from calling those biological trends A and B, or orange and purple? Similarly, why do we think of some sexual characteristics, like genitals and chromosomes, as fundamental parts of sex, which make a difference to how we categorize a person's body, and others, like facial hair and fat distribution, as comparatively insignificant? Why do we think of sex as binary, dividing humans into two clear biological types, when in reality it's a spectrum on which comparatively few people tick all the boxes required to slot neatly into one of those two categories? Why do so many societies still carry out violent, non-consensual, and medically unnecessary surgery on intersex children, children whose bodies don't fit clearly into one of the categories we label male and female? The answer to all of those questions is that gender, that socially constructed idea which carries all of the social baggage we associate with maleness and femaleness, informs, even produces, our idea about sex. In the words of trans writer and activist Sean Fay, our sexed bodies never exist outside social meanings. Consequently, how we understand gender shapes how we understand sex. The way we perceive and understand sex differences and emphasizes their significance is so deeply gendered that it can be impossible to completely divorce the two. To say sex and gender are both socially constructed isn't to say that they're not real. Like other social constructs, including race, money, and crime, they have material and life-changing consequences for all of us. But it is to say there's no innate reason we have to think about them in the way that we do. Given that we don't think about gender and sex in a coherent way today, it's no surprise. It's no surprise that these ideas were equally unstable in the past. The idea of gender as socially constructed and distinct from sex didn't become common parlance in English until the mid-20th century. That isn't to say that before this it was only bodies that mattered. Gender and sex were used interchangeably, with sex far more common, and both referred to a combination of the social and biological. To adapt the words of trans theorist and historian Suzanne Stryker, both gender and sex referred to the social organization of different kinds of bodies into different categories of people. When the clergyman Thomas Stoughton complained in 1622 that men and women had changed their sex as much as they can, one with another, by men wearing long hair like unto women, and women cutting off their hair like unto boys, he was referring both to their bodies and to their social experience. This was complicated even further by the fact that Stoughton and his contemporaries understood the biological makeup of the body and its relationship to personality and society very differently from the way that we do today. As a result, we can't even straightforwardly apply our modern concepts of men and women to people in the past. The term gender, until it started to refer more exclusively to men and women in the mid-20th century, just meant kind or sort. When Shakespeare referred to one gender of herbs in his play Othello, this is what he meant. In the sense gender is related to the word genre, which we use to categorize two different kinds of art into many more groups than just two. There's also the problem that, in any society, what constitutes male, female, or any gender is different for different people. How we understand gender is shaped by so many factors, personal, cultural, historical, that every individual's conceptualization of gender is unique. For some people, being a man necessitates not wearing a dress, even as a joke, meaning John Sullivan, our 19th century gender non-conforming thief, wouldn't qualify as male. In my own life, my wardrobe of floral shirts and dangly earrings means a visit to the shops can be a lottery in terms of whether I'll be called sir or madam, or, on one memorable occasion, equal parts validating and amusing, young person. If I played a professional sport, my testosterone levels would make me a man. If I got pregnant, my doctor's computer system would force me to be labeled a woman. If you asked me, I'd tell you neither category is accurate. Instead, I use the term non-binary to describe myself. And yet the way I understand that term is different from many of my non-binary friends. What if it means to be a man, a woman, or not? If what it means to be a man, a woman, or a non-binary person is different for everyone and varies between contexts, how can we straightforwardly talk about people who don't identify as the gender that they were assigned at birth, in either the past or the present? Despite these difficulties and complexities, trans people love to tell stories from our history. Feeling a sense of community within the past is profoundly important for many of us, and particularly for those of us who are isolated in our day-to-day lives. As a teenager, struggling to articulate my feelings around gender and sexuality, I confided far more in the queer historical figures who populated my mental landscape than I did in the friends I saw every day at school. Talking about our history is politically important too, helping to undermine arguments that, as I'll talk more about later, present trans people as newfangled inventions, simultaneously suggesting that we're on a trend that shouldn't be taken seriously, or that we're a potent new threat. The tales of trans history that we tell often for personal and political reasons have a familiar cast. They feature people like Billy Tipton, the American jazz musician who lived as male, and whose family and friends were shocked when he was outed as trans after his death in 1989, and his 19th century antecedent James Barry, the Irish surgeon who similarly lived as male for all of his adult life, and was outed against his will after his death in 1865. We talk too about the pioneers of medical transition like Lily Ilb, the Danish trans woman made famous by the disappointing 2015 film The Danish Girl, who was one of the earliest recipients of modern Western form of gender reassignment surgery, and Christine Jorgensen, who traveled from her native New York to Denmark to access medical transition and was made famous by the sensational 1952 New York Daily News headline, "XGI becomes blonde beauty." These stories and their well-known characters are profoundly valuable. There's a powerful, electrifying force to the resonance we feel when we realize someone else has felt our feelings before us. The queer theorist Carolyn Dinshaw uses the image of a touch across time, an image that always reminds me of the line about literature in Alan Bennett's The History of Boys, as if a hand has come out and taken yours. But when we look closely at these stories, we can see that they have a troubling The trans histories that we point to most often are the easy stories. They are the stories of people who lived stably in a gender distinct from the one they were assigned at birth. People who, even if they didn't have access to the word transgender, lived recently enough to fit into modern Western understandings of sex and gender. People who pursued medical transition if they had access to it. People from whom we have first-hand testimony saying that they wanted to be recognized as the gender they lived in. Even if we occasionally draw on long-ago stories, like that of the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, who, according to multiple contemporary accounts, presented as female and sought gender reassignment surgery. They tend to be those that are easily, uncomplicatedly recognizable according to these modern Western ideas of what it means to be trans. And if we mention trans people of color, like Marsha P. Johnson, they're often deployed tokenistically in an attempt to make sure our cast of trans historical figures isn't entirely white, without really taking the time to understand the specificities of their experience. If we try to slot John Sullivan into this cast of trans historical characters, we fail on every count. But John's story is crucial. It's crucial because it represents the tip of an iceberg, just one of a huge number of difficult, complicated stories from the history of gender that we don't have a good way to talk about. And it's crucial because it forces us to confront the fact that there are two big problems with how we decide whether a story counts as trans history. The first problem, and one the 1847 story of John's dress exemplifies, is that a lot of the evidence we have for gender nonconforming lives comes from legal and medical contexts. These are the kinds of records in which gender nonconforming people overwhelmingly become visible. But law and medicine aren't neutral contexts in which people give objective narratives of their experience. They're high-stakes environments in which we construct a narrative for an authority figure whose decisions have huge consequences for our lives. As a result, we might adopt a particular discourse or way of speaking suited to the environment. We might strategically edit the truth to give a more coherent or believable narrative. We might even simply lie, telling those authority figures what they want to hear. If, in a century's time, a historian looked at the records of gender identity clinics in the UK, their estimate of how many non-binary people accessed medical transition would be much smaller than the true number. Knowing that clinicians can still be suspicious of non-binary identities, we've been taught to edit our stories, to present ourselves as trans men or women in the hope of accessing medical treatment more quickly, so we can't rely on the accuracy of legal or medical records to tell us about the truth of trans experience in the past. What's more, even when trans people do tell the truth in these official contexts, we can't always rely on official documents to record their voices or wishes accurately, as demonstrated by the many obituaries of trans people that misgender their subjects. For John Sullivan, then, it was expedient, to present the gender nonconformity of the 8th of June 1847 as a drunken lark, to choose the legal censure of theft over the moral censure of cross-dressing, which was associated with sexual deviance and thereby carried legal risks too. Just because it was expedient doesn't mean that John's account wasn't true, of course, but it does call into question how much we can rely on it, and whether we can use it as a reason to definitively exclude John from our narratives of trans history. The second problem with our existing criteria for inclusion in trans history is that they privilege an incredibly narrow version of what it means to be trans. The trans histories we tend to tell are those that conform to the trans narrative that that's centered and recapitulated in contemporary media. The non-binary writer and activist Jacob Tobiah, in their memoir Sissy, a coming of gender story, has brilliantly likened this narrative to the game Mad Lib, a story with a pre-written skeleton format where the teller fills in the specifics from a limited list of options. The Mad Lib trans narrative begins in childhood, with the trans person articulating their early stable sense that they were in the wrong body and conforming to stereotypes opposite to those of the gender they were assigned at birth. After a long and traumatic struggle with themselves, they come out, medically transition to male or female, and live in a conventional gender-conforming and heterosexual life. While this is an accurate depiction of many trans people's lives, and nothing about its dominance makes these trans people's experiences any less valid or radical, it's inaccurate, indeed inadequate, for many more. And as Tobias suggests, the dominance of this narrative perpetuates and reinforces the idea that it's the only trans narrative that cisgender people want to hear, and the only trans story that cisgender people can comprehend. As a result, this narrative shapes contemporary trans stories, and all trans lives appear fundamentally similar. In order to get to what we need, whether that be medical treatment, legal gender recognition, or social validation of our identities, we fit our stories around contemporary standards of coherence and validity. In doing so, we continue the cycle, perpetuating the idea that this is the only way to be trans. For people today who are struggling with their gender, trying to work out whether social or medical transition is right for them, these narrow ideas of what it means to be trans can be genuinely harmful. There's certainly the reason it took me so long to figure out my own gender. The few piecemeal images of transness I had access to as a child were heavily medicalized, all suggesting that being trans was something you did to change your body, not something you felt. I didn't know it was possible for trans people to be anything other than straight, for them not to conform to gender stereotypes, or for them not to have always known in a kind of static, essentialized way that they weren't the gender they were assigned at birth. When I tried to articulate my feelings about my gender to friends and therapists, none of them recognized them as transness either. It wasn't until I started volunteering for the charity York LGBT History Month in the autumn of 2014, ostensibly as an enthusiastic LGBTQ ally, looking for a way to engage the public with my PhD research on King Edward II's sexual reputation, but really, as I soon realized, a way of forcing myself to finally confront the reasons why I cared so fiercely about queer history and rights, that I was able to truly get to grips with new ways of thinking about gender, and to realize where I fitted in. Nobody on the York LGBT History Month committee asked me to explain what I was doing there, but my involvement with them turned out to be the push I needed to explain it to myself. Sorry for punching the mic. This difficult process, giving myself permission to finally take my feelings seriously, to present myself differently, and to ask for the name and pronouns that made me happy, turned out to be the tip of the iceberg. It was explaining to everybody else that really revealed the perniciousness of the narrow trans narrative constructed by contemporary media. Friends and family alike contrasted being non-binary with being properly trans, some saying they were glad I wasn't the latter. A member of the HR department where I worked asked derisively whether genderqueer, the word I used to describe myself, was an official term. a question that, grimly hilarious in retrospect, suggests a belief in a literal gender police who legislate over what trans people are and aren't allowed to call ourselves. When I corrected one man I knew after he used my old name, he was surprised, asking, "Do you always correct people?" As if being non-binary meant my commitment to my gender was temporary or half-hearted. By the time I got into an NHS gender identity clinic, 12 months after my referral, a wait that was one of the worst times in my life, but which is far exceeded by most of today's inhumane waiting lists, I was prepared. I was going to tell them a version of the truth that stuck to the Mad Lib trans narrative as closely as possible. As a white middle-class person, it was going to be far easier for me to have my gender taken seriously than it would be for many others, but I still wasn't going to risk them denying me treatment I needed because my gender didn't fit the mold. The narrow trans narrative we see emphasized in contemporary media, then, makes life harder for people who experience their transness in a way that's not binary, stereotyped, or stable. And this narrative also makes it difficult to tell histories that fully reflect the messy reality of trans life today. Jacob Tobiah describes the standard trans narrative as classical, and the way it operates with regard to history is in fact comparable to the classics of literature. It determines which stories constitute the canon of trans history, which stories get retold and reread while others languish in the dusty corners of second-hand bookshops or are confined to the specialist university courses. The canon has, like the literary canon more generally, no space for people of color, especially not those whose experience of gender is culturally specific. It has no space for the history of gender fluidity, for people whose genders change throughout their lives, or are different in different contexts. It has no space for the history of playful or creative approaches to gender, for people who experiment with different forms of gender expression or nonconformity. It has no space for the histories of people whose gender is ambiguous or messy. It has no space for people who feel like some or all of the factors that determine their gender come from outside themselves rather than inside. It has no space for the histories of people who can't articulate their gender clearly or resist the imperative to do so. Often, what this means is that our narratives of trans history are recent, avoiding challenges of terminology or evidence, binary, including only those trans people whose identities are male or female, stereotyped, limited to those who live and present in a way that conforms to the contemporary social expectations about that gender identity, and medicalized, restricted to those who have accessed medical transition wherever possible. And perhaps most damagingly, it also often means that our trans histories are white. In fact, our contemporary idea of what it means to be trans has itself been shaped by those well-known trans people like Christine Jorgensen, who were able to conform to the ideals of white femininity or masculinity. More broadly, the impact of colonialist ideology on the way white historians write about history, and the impact of racism on whose history books get read, has led to a widespread failure to acknowledge the histories of people of color whose experience of gender can't be contained within a modern Western binary. Alright, my friends, this is quite a long introduction. I am about halfway through, and the video's at 40 minutes. So, I think what might make the most sense for all of us is that we stop now, and I'll finish it another day. little bit different and a little bit repetitive for my content. I do a lot of reading content, but I don't do a lot of nonfiction reading content. I personally am not a huge nonfiction person, but there are certain books, certain topics that I definitely enjoy within nonfiction. So I hope you enjoyed too. I'm definitely learning as I'm reading this, and I am a non-binary person, so I hope you are enjoying learning a little bit with me. And remember, if you like this introduction, feel free to go support the author. I bought this book brand new, and it was $20, which is honestly really good for a new book. So, yes, I hope you enjoyed. I find this kind of stuff fascinating. I know not everyone does, but, you know, I hope you have a great afternoon, evening, morning, whatever, and I will see you next time.